Welcome to Corpstruction, a show about the missions, activities, and employees of the Tulsa District, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Today I'm joined by Dr. Tony Clyde. Dr. Clyde is currently a project manager in our Civil Works branch, but he spent many years here in the Tulsa District as our limnologist. Now, Dr. Clyde, welcome to Corpstruction.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And can you tell us what a limnologist is?
Yeah. A limnologist is a biologist who specializes in the study of reservoirs and lakes. So limnos is the Greek word for lake, ology, study of, and so study of lakes and reservoirs.
And one of the areas that you especially focused on when you were working as a limnologist here was blue-green algae and harmful algal blooms. Can you talk about what that is exactly? What the difference is between necessarily blue-green algae in general versus a harmful algal bloom?
Yeah. So blue-green algae are also known as cyanobacteria, and over the course of time, recent time, classifying organisms, the cyanobacteria have bounced back and forth between the division cyanobacteria and cyanophyta. So ophyta meaning plant, cyanobacteria, of course, bacteria being bacteria. So they are organisms that have both plant and bacteria characteristics. So they're bacteria that have a chloroplast, basically. They photosynthesize. And so they are a natural component of all aquatic ecosystems. Like any ecosystem, they can become out of balance because of anthropogenic or human forces and activities, or just because of the natural cycle of ecosystems where growth and then growth and decline repeatedly over time. So when a HAB occurs, a harmful algal bloom, we refer to as a HAB. When a HAB occurs and it's dominated by cyanobacteria, that's just an event that occurs when those cyanobacteria grow to such a level in the aquatic environment that they pose a risk or a threat to human and other natural and wildlife resources.
Now, is all blue-green algae harmful in terms of its potential impact on humans or fish or animals?
So that's a great question, because harmful is based on the point of view that you're looking at a harmful algal bloom from, or any algal bloom. So cyanobacteria are not the only algae or bacteria that occur in aquatic environments. And again, they're a natural component of the ecosystem. So you can have non-cyanobacterial algal growth that occurs that can be harmful as well. So green algae is a group of algae, red algae, yellow algae. They all have those are common names, but they can all grow to levels where they become harmful to the ecosystem when they go through a point in their growth pattern that's called senescence. And so that's when you have growth, the upward increase in biomass of an algal species of any kind, of any group, and it peaks, and then it goes into senescence, which is that die-off. And as the individuals in that population die off, they put a biological or a chemical oxygen demand on the water, and they're using up oxygen that's in the water to decay. And that can lead to a harmful effect in terms of available oxygen to fish and other aquatic wildlife that rely on that oxygen that's dissolved in the water.
And the microcystine, right? That's usually the chemical or the thing that they give off that is harmful potentially to humans, or.
So again, there's lots of different ways to look at what is harmful and what isn't. So the impact on available oxygen in the water column is one aspect that algal blooms can be harmful. For cyanobacterial blooms, the other aspect of how harmful they can be to humans and to other wildlife is the fact that some cyanobacterial species are able to produce what are called cyanotoxins. Microcystin is one cyanotoxin that is produced, but there are multiple cyanotoxins that are produced depending on whether the freshwater or a marine organism. But my focus historically has been on freshwater systems, and that's what I'll probably focus. That's what I will focus on today. But when a cyanobacteria bloom starts to produce those cyanotoxins, microcystin being one, and the most commonly one that is produced by a cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, the microcystin can occur in concentrations that are harmful to mammals, humans, and other wildlife. And the organisms that are most commonly impacted, that we have documented that are most commonly impacted by microcystin and other cyanotoxins, tend to be domestic animals and mammalian wildlife, but especially companion animals, so like dogs and cattle tend to be the mammals that we see impacts in most commonly.
Are there cases that you're aware of, even with like stock ponds, where cattle have drank from a stock pond that may have gotten developed outbreaks or anything?
Yeah, several states, including Oklahoma and Kansas in the Tulsa District, as well as Texas and the highest number of stock pond or cattle pond impacts that I have read about due to cyanobacteria and microcystin production and impacting cattle have been in Oklahoma and Texas. And regularly you will see ag newsletters and NRCS, USDA, and state agricultural agencies, as well as extension offices, put out almost annual reminders now to keep an eye on stock ponds, particularly later in the summer when it gets hot and calm and the conditions become more favorable for excessive cyanobacterial growth in those stock ponds.
Algal blooms in general have been localized to areas, or spotty, right, on certain lakes. Like you can see them on any lake, but you would see a spot, and they're typically localized to where you see the spot, right? Or how do you identify and make a determination?
So there's a lot of factors that go into that, and our ability to track algal blooms in general, cyanobacterial blooms or harmful algal blooms specifically, via remote sensing, satellite platforms, and even with drone footage as well, has increased quite a bit over the last 5 years, particularly, but over the last 10 years especially, as that technology has improved and the algorithms have been developed to take satellite imagery and to assess for chlorophyll or for another pigment that is specific to cyanobacteria in fresh water, which is called phycocyanin, or phycocyanin. I'm sorry.
Phycocyanin.
Yeah. So
it's insane.
It can be sometimes. And your tongue gets twisted with all these
right.
big science words. So
the term is phycocyanin.
Is phycocyanin, and so so we're able to use satellite platforms and some tools developed by the US EPA and the USGS, as well as the Corps of Engineers and our Engineer Research Development Center, that allow for the Corps specifically, and for other other lake managers that manage non-federal reservoirs, to access those remotely sensed data and to access the algorithms via websites to take a quick, hard, fast look at HAB impacts based on how frequently those satellite platforms fly over. So some satellites fly over a lake every 2 weeks, some fly over every 3 hours, some you can actually task if you have the ability to task satellites, and you can task them to go over a reservoir that may be heavily impacted every every 3 hours or every 6 hours, whatever the tasking allowance is for a satellite. But we're able to use those, or you can go out and old-fashioned muddy water biologist, limnologist type of sampling, and just go dip water from a boat and fill up some jars and send them off to a lab and a phycologist, a algal taxonomist, and have them look and tell you what you have as well. But yeah, they can be, when you're seeing them with the naked eye, the unaided eye, you'll see green concentrations of water, or of cyano, blue-green concentration of water up in a cove or up against a shoreline. What really helps with management of bloom exposure and recreation management and informing people of the risk associated with these types of blooms is with the satellite platforms and the remotely sensed data, you get a bird's eye view of the entire lake, and you can look at how the concentration varies from area to area. So even though you can't see something with the naked eye or the unaided eye, there still may be cyanobacteria present at concentrations that could cause a
reaction,
a reaction, either a dermal reaction, or would trigger a threshold in a state HAB response policy if that particular state has one in place.
Now, in the way we work, you kind of worked on the protocols that we use in conjunction with the states, right?
Yeah, we've interacted quite a bit with the states of Oklahoma and Kansas within the Tulsa District area of responsibility, and have worked very collaboratively with both states to develop HAB response policies, to incorporate those policies into the way we manage our recreation areas, and to be able to alert the public to increased risks to recreation that harmful algal blooms can pose. And so in Oklahoma, they're referred to as a blue-green algae awareness level, or awareness alert level, that you may have seen some of the commercials that aired during the summertime from the Oklahoma Department of Tourism and Recreation. They came up with a great motto that if it's green on top, stop, and they put a stop sign in the ad. It may be blue-green algae. And so just to pause if you see discolored water, and check in with the ranger station or with the volunteer station at the gate shack, or if you're at a core reservoir, or one of our volunteers, they'll be in the know usually about what the HAB risks are on any given lake at any given time based on our sampling. And in Kansas, it's a little bit different. They actually have a more aggressive response plan in terms of quite a few more stages of warning, of advisory levels and warnings, and lake closures and hazard warnings that are all based on cell densities and toxin levels, primarily, again, microcystin that I talked about earlier. But those are the two categories that really are, or that those thresholds for action from the state are really based on.
And we'll do the sampling for the state typically, but we'll send it to the state. Is that correct? Or does it vary by state?
It varies by state, because the states have basically taken the lead on development of HAB response protocols for the most part. And so in the lakes in Kansas, where our recreation customers would visit, the state of Kansas, the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, they do the majority of the sampling, and we support those efforts logistically, or sometimes with staff to actually go out and collect the samples. But then they run the samples and incorporate those into their state database, run them through their policy, and then weekly during the recreation season, they will issue changes to any advisories, warnings, or hazard conditions that occur across the state of Kansas. Conversely, in Oklahoma, for the core reservoirs, we will sample when we have a a harmful algal bloom or a potential harmful algal bloom that is reported to our lake office, then our lake office will coordinate with biologists, limnologists in the district office to collect samples, have those analyzed by the contractors that we have available to us through blanket purchase agreements and through our relationships with the Engineer Research Development Center. Provides a great deal of support to the district on water quality and HAB response. And then we will coordinate with Oklahoma Department of Tourism and Recreation to interpret the data, and then the OTRD, the Oklahoma Department of Tourism and Recreation, will put out the risk communication to the recreating public through the OTRD website on a Check My Lake page, and they provide fishing status and water quality status updates on that page.
What do we know? What causes or what the big contributors are to blooms, and why they may be more common in some places than others?
Yeah, so historically, it was thought that it was excess phosphorus and not enough nitrogen being present in the water. And some cyanobacteria have the ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen. So in the presence of excess phosphorus, which doesn't limit growth, and their ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen, they're just able to outcompete other members of the algal assemblage overall. A lot of those other blue, green
colors?
algae, the other colors of the rainbow, so to speak. It is Pride Month, so like everywhere else, the colors of the rainbow are there in the lake. So, but the green algae, the yellow algae, the red algae, they're just able to outcompete those. And diatoms as well are another important component of the algal assemblage that are almost like little glass discs, petri dishes, and they have a lot of silica in them. And so they're diatomaceous earth is made from diatoms in the old diatoms in old lake and ocean sediments. So it allows the cyanobacteria to outcompete those other members of the algal assemblage or the phytoplankton assemblage, and so that historically was the primary focus, was nitrogen and phosphorus. In reality, like so many other things, is that the real answer is a lot more complex, and so the lake is full of a lot of things: bacteria, algae, fish, insects, and they're all interacting with each other. But there's been a lot of focus recently in some more recent R&D, research and development initiatives of academics and government agencies that focus on the microbiome of the lake itself. So there's like the emphasis recently on the microbiome of the gut, and for gut health, the microbiome of the lake also it can inform you on lake health. And so those bacteria are interacting with each other. And so nutrients do play a role. Temperature, water temperature, and atmospheric temperature do play a role. Light availability, how muddy the water is, how turbid the water is. We call it turbidity, but basically how cloudy or muddy the water is, limits how deep light will penetrate into a water column. The deeper light goes, the more volume there is in the water for active photosynthesis, and so the deeper the layer of active photosynthesis is in that surface layer of water. So light availability plays a role in bloom formation and in competition, and then just general hydrology. So we tend not to see blooms occur while we're making a lot of releases and passing things through the lake. So if we're making flood control releases, we tend to see, in general, in broad generalities, we tend to see less of an algal bloom if there is one. Conversely, there have been periods of time where we're holding back flood waters, and we have what happens is an influx of water comes into the lake. We hold it for a period of time without making releases, because we're making releases not only from a lake during floods, but within the basin as a whole. And different lakes have different priorities for releases under those water control plans. We've seen periods where we're holding water back in a reservoir, and the nutrient loading then occurs in the reservoir. There's a lot of excess nutrients then available. We're not making releases. The inflows stop. The water clears, and then we see a huge bloom. That happened at multiple reservoirs back in 2011, following some floods.
Really?
In the central Great Plains, south central Great Plains, in Oklahoma, Kansas, and parts of Nebraska.
There's almost, pretty much everywhere you go, there's some amount of BGA in the water, whether you see it or not, right? Like there's always that's always present, right?
It is. It's as a lot of our guidance that the Corps uses, the Tulsa District uses, and just the basic ecology 101 is that cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, are a natural component of the ecosystem, and they become excessive and can become a harmful algal bloom when that growth occurs in excess of and outcompetes the other natural components of the phytoplankton assemblage.
And are there organisms that actually feed upon blue-green algae?
So there are some organisms that will feed on blue-green algae. There are also a lot of organisms that that are filter feeders that can select against blue-green algae. So in terms of the nutritional value of blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, over other types of algae, they are less nutritious for mussels, other bivalves that occur, other zooplankton, rotifers, other grazers that occur in the system, even something like a paddlefish, which is
right.
a filter feeder. They're not going to be able to actively select against blue-green algae on purpose, but even there, blue-green algae, some blue-green algae form large colonies. Some are individual filaments and don't form huge colonies, but they're individual filaments of just a few cells that can pass through those filters on that the paddlefish use to filter phytoplankton out of the water column. But evolutionarily, even some of the filter feeders that can't actively select against blue-green algae, the size of the filtration apparatus that they use to filter water to feed selects against blue-green algae because they just don't have a lot of nutritional value.
So does that mean it just passes through?
Just passes through, yeah. So,
and there aren't microorganisms that we know of that really feed upon it, or
not to a great extent, not that we're aware of. No.
Okay. So when you have a bloom, I guess conditions, whatever they are, atmospheric or nutrient or sunlight, whatever, eventually it has to reach critical mass, right? Do we know what causes a bloom to hit a sort of a critical mass and then revert?
So with any growth cycle, you have exponential growth. So what happens here is it's a very typical exponential growth cycle. You have this exponential growth and high biomass, high numbers of individuals, but ultimately it's a very high biomass. It hits a peak, and then it drops off a cliff, basically a straight line down, and the population crashes. And so in an algal population or a cyanobacterial population, what occurs is that they hit a limiting factor, and that could be nutrient availability. It could be a micronutrient availability at that, not just nitrogen and phosphorus, but some other micronutrient that's critical to them. It could be that a flood or a rain event has occurred, or a wind event occurred that caused either sediment resuspension through inflowing water from the watershed, or a sediment resuspension event within the lake from high wind activity, which is
so that
uncommon.
means like the bottom gets kicked up and you get dirty looking water.
You get dirty looking water because
right.
the wind is blowing, wave action stirs up the sediments or the mud on the bottom
right.
of the lake. the lake then light doesn't penetrate as deeply into the water column, and so light becomes the limiting factor there, and so you have a die-off. And then again, when that die-off occurs, it can, if the cyanobacterial bloom is producing toxins, those cyanotoxins, microcystin again being the most common one, but there are others, including what's called anatoxin A, saxitoxin, and cylindrospermopsin, and they're a variety of either neurotoxins or liver toxins. So they either affect your nervous system or your liver, or well, I don't say yours. They affect mammalian nerve systems and mammalian liver systems. And so microcystin happens to be a hepatotoxin, a liver toxin, so it affects a mammalian liver. But when that die-off occurs, that any toxin that's being produced in that cell can be released into the water column. So then if you consume water, or if a mammal consumes water from the lake, there's potential for exposure that route. And then there's also the bacterial or the I should say the biological or the chemical oxygen demand of that dying biomass, that senescing algal biomass that just draws the oxygen out of the water as it decays, which then can lead to an anoxic zone, a low oxygen or no oxygen zone that can either trap fish or that could lead to a minor fish kill, because then the fish can't breathe. There's not enough oxygen for them. So
does the BGA sort of, or the HAB or whatever, whether we call it a HAB, or does the HAB end up like sort of dying in its own waste product?
It's not so much that it dies in its own waste product. It just there's a nutrient or some other ecological factor necessary for their growth becomes limited, and they die off. Okay. So, and in that die off, then you get again that oxygen demand on the water column can be looked at as so from that perspective, you can look at that as similar to other. You don't want to soil your own nest, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. So, you don't want to poop where you eat. Right.
Yeah. So So to equate that to, say, like a wastewater treatment plant, the reason why we treat wastewater to the degree that we do before we release it back into the environment is historically, when we were just pumping raw sewage into a river system or a creek system.
Go ahead.
Into the creek system or river system, what happens is that that biomass, that decaying biomass that is excreted from, or that is discharged into the creek untreated, puts that same kind of chemical or biological oxygen demand on that system, to the point that those types of demands, that oxygen demand, is actually for a wastewater treatment plant, to close this loop. For a wastewater treatment plant, biological oxygen demand and chemical oxygen demand are oftentimes tests that are written into their National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit, allowing them to discharge that treated effluent into a surface water again, to ensure that there's not that demand put on the system that will cause fish kills and other oxygen issues downstream. So from that perspective, it is almost like a soil their own nest in terms of that when that bloom dies and it puts an oxygen demand on the water column, it's very similar.
Yeah. So it creates a resource stress, right? So they don't have what they need to survive anymore. But you said it tends to go like a cliff almost, right? After you have one, if in the absence of, say, like more rain or turbidity, when you just see it and it's been sunny for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or however long it lasts, it will hit a point where it will use up the resources in its area or wherever it is, and then it will start a die-off cycle. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And what you can also see is that sometimes when you have these other natural, what we call natural perturbations, but natural disturbances that occur from rain events, wind events, a number of cloudy days that can also, so nothing, you could have no inflow events or no wind events, just a number of cloudy days that limit light. Really? And so you'll see a slight senescence, but then that doesn't. Then the clouds clear and light's no longer limited, and then you'll see another growth spurt. So you can see things that look like an exponential growth curve, and then they level off, but it doesn't crash. Then
Right.
that limiting factor doesn't become limiting anymore, and it grows some more, levels off, and then may grow through another cycle. And then ultimately, though, any exponential growth curve that ultimately hits a point where resources become so limited, whatever that limiting resource is, and then that population crashes. And it's just a traditional exponential growth curve straight out of an ecology textbook. That's a very sigmoid S-shaped curve where you've got slow growth for a period of time, and then it gets into the exponential phase, which doesn't have to be a straight line up, but it's a pretty steep sloped line up. Mm-hmm. Then it will slowly level out again, but at some point that resource limits, and then a population will drop down to below the population numbers where that exponential growth started a lot of times.
So how do we, there's not anything we can really do right now to treat a bloom, right, after the fact? Is it just a time thing? You have to wait, or is there something we can do?
So
that doesn't that doesn't create more problems. You know what I mean?
So before you meddle, to make sure you don't throw away all the parts, or any of the parts. There's always that to keep in mind. Yes, things that we can do to control. So we don't really have a lot of control options right now. There have been some initiatives funded congressionally. So over the last 3 or 4 years, the Corps and other agencies have been funded to address the prevention, control, and mitigation of harmful algal blooms, particularly focusing on cyanobacterial blooms, but also some hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico have been included in some of the legislation that has passed. But for the Corps specifically, the Engineer Research Development Center has funded a number of research and development projects recently with the direction and funding from Congress appropriated through the Water Resources Development Act that gets specifically at options to control harmful algal blooms or to mitigate their impacts. The focus of that ongoing research, one of the critical components that Congress wanted the Corps to address was that that any technologies that are assessed are scalable. So not just research and development that you can be successful on a benchtop in a laboratory, but that you can actually apply in the real world on lakes. And so just to keep in mind how big our lakes are, we have lakes that range from 110,000 acre feet or so in Tulsa District all the way down to 6,000, not acre feet, 110,000 surface acres all the way down to about 5,800 or 6,000 surface acres.
Like that. It's kind of like
Canton is like that.
It's 6,000.
Yeah, and Marion and Reservoir in Kansas is about 6,000 surface acres. I think it's Eufaula is somewhere in that 108, 110,000 surface acres. Lake Texoma is 85,000 surface acres. So so we have some large reservoirs, we have some small reservoirs, and so any of the technologies to control and prevent and mitigate these HABs, even if they are scalable, there's a cost prohibitive factor when you get to these huge reservoirs, but you can deal with coves. And so a lot of the efforts that the Corps has underway now, and that the Tulsa District has participated in some of these R&D efforts through either requesting assistance from ERDIC or participating as a co-principal investigator on some of these, but looking at being able to partition off swim beaches and treat them with hydrogen peroxide is an approved pesticide or herbicide, depending on how we want to look at it. But it's approved by the U.S. EPA as a pesticide that can be applied to aquatic systems that is labeled to treat for cyanobacteria.
wow.
There's also granular versions and liquid versions of the peroxide treatment. Of course, there's the tried and true copper-based algicides, pesticides that are out there that have historically been used to treat for harmful algal growth, not just cyanobacteria growth, but algae growth in general. And copper has some. It's a hazardous metal in high concentrations to mammals, and so there's a lot of dis-ease with using that in water supply reservoirs, particularly. But it's not uncommon, and it's been, if you use it correctly, like anything, and you don't overuse it and you don't overapply it, it can do the job that it's meant to do without causing adverse effects or unlimited adverse effects in the environment. The preference has been to focus on a lot of peroxide-based herbicides to look at the prevention and control of cyanobacteria. So we're involved with ongoing research and development on that front, and then.
But we're not doing that scale like district wide. That would be something that we would be doing study on at this point, right?
We're working with ERDIC on the studies that they have funded, and so Marion Reservoir has been one of the. So Marion Reservoir in Kansas, for those of you out there that may not be aware, was the first reservoir in Tulsa that bloomed with a harmful algal bloom, and that was back in 2004. And has bloomed every year since then, and the blooms are quite intense, and they produce some microcystin toxins, and we've gone through series of warnings and advisories, and sometimes a lake closure here and there in some years when the bloom has presented hazardous conditions to the recreating public, and the Kansas Department of Health and Environment has recommended closure. We've gone along with that. So there's a long history there. There are other lakes in the district that have experienced some minor harmful algal blooms, but Marion is one that is well known, and it's in the news quite a bit. And then in an adjacent watershed just outside of the Tulsa District is Milford Lake, which has also had a lot of press and a lot of research and development interest from the Kansas Department of Health and Environment and from ERDIC and from the U.S. EPA as well for addressing HAB issues there. And so we're participating. When I say we're participating in that, the district is not doing the R&D and the studies on our own, but we are a partner with ERDIC and with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment looking at different options available to mitigate the impact of harmful algal blooms to some key mission areas for the Corps when they occur. Primarily what we're looking at is recreation and our fish and wildlife mission areas. We also have a mission area for water supply, but that mission for water supply is related to storage and to ensuring that the lake is available to meet the contractual storage that we have with the water supply customer, not necessarily on water quality.
Right.
So our water quality focus through these R&D efforts is on the water quality and HAB impacts to these other critical mission areas that we have. And there's also concern longer term that even on our flood risk management, our water management mission, and how we operate gates during flood control operations or regular operations in the conservation pools of our reservoirs, is that when there is a bloom, but we have requirements to meet downstream flow needs, and those blooms are producing toxins, or we're releasing algae or cyanobacteria downstream into other reaches of the watershed. Are there impacts related to those operations? And those are areas that have been a key focus for the Corps and for state regulatory agencies around Lake Okeechobee in Jacksonville District in Florida as well. If you were to Google HAB Lake Okeechobee, you would see any number of HAB events that have included the EPA and the CDC and the Florida Department of Environment and Health and the Florida Department of Fish and Game and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the USGS and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration also does a lot of support to the Corps and the state in that part of the United States related specifically to HAB response, HAB monitoring, and looking at ways to mitigate the impacts of those HABs to people who live and work around Lake Okeechobee.
So what do people need to mostly know with regard to HABs, or if you think you see it, I guess is stop and what's important for people to know about the outbreaks or the potential for the outbreaks?
So I think the most important thing for people to know is that be aware that harmful algal blooms exist, that they can occur in water bodies throughout the Tulsa District. There are lakes that have never had a cyanobacteria bloom on them in the past, but that doesn't mean that there won't be one in the future. Be aware that when you see discolored water, it could be a blue-green algae bloom. It could be a cyanobacteria bloom. And the state's messaging on that is really clear. If it's green, stop. It might be blue-green algae. If you see discolored water, that doesn't mean that you can't recreate at the water's edge. It doesn't mean that you can't utilize other recreation resources available to you on the lake or on the shoreline. It just means that in that portion of the lake where you see that bloom, what we call primary body contact, but body contact with the water may put you at greater risk. Children are at greater risk than adults. Pets are at greater risk than children. Pets will wade in the water. The algae gets stuck in their fur. They lick the fur. They're drinking the water, and then they're licking the fur, so their fur acts as a filter in a way. It concentrates algae in their fur, and they get a higher dose than they would just from drinking the water. But sometimes there's enough toxin, microcystin, released in the water that just consuming the water can harm a dog, either make the dog ill, give them liver damage, or it could result in the dog's or animal's death. So there are very few human deaths and poisonings attributed to cyanobacterial toxins. The ones that have occurred, that have been documented in the scientific literature, are related to very unique events that were not the result of a recreational exposure. So there is a risk. It's a low risk. In that discolored water, children are going to consume more water just by splashing around than an adult would. Children consume maybe, 80 milliliters of water during 30 minutes of swimming and splashing in a lake or a pool, relative to an adult that may only consume or accidentally, inadvertently consume like 50 milliliters of water. So again, there's that risk, but the risk is low. But it is there. And so just being aware of the risks so that you can, for yourself and your family, make the best recreation decision that you can for you based on the available information. And so when you see that discolored water, what we ask folks to do is just think about it, check in with the ranger, check in with the gate shack or where the entry gate attendant where you checked into that campground. They'll be aware of any cyanobacteria or blue-green algae alert notices that the Corps or the state, either in Kansas or Oklahoma, have put together. And I haven't mentioned Texas much because where we have facilities in Texas, it's at the south bank of Lake Texoma, and then Pat Mays Lake in Texas, and we've just adopted what we've put in place for our Oklahoma lakes for those for the side of Lake Texoma, and for Pat Mays, just for some consistency for the staff there then in Lake Texoma and the Red River office that have responsibility for the recreation mission there at the lakes.
What have I not asked you that I probably should have asked you that it's important for people to know?
I think what is really important for folks to know that you haven't hit on particularly is that there is a very active effort across state and federal agencies nationally that are addressing HAB-related issues, both from a surface water recreation, lake management perspective, and from a water supply perspective. So a lot of things that have gotten in the news is since 2014 is water supply. The city of Toledo's water supply was shut down because of algal toxins in Lake Erie. The city of Salem's water supply was shut down for a sensitive population because of some low-level microcystin toxins that were found in finished water several years ago. And there is some legislation that continues to be reauthorized by Congress. It's called the Harmful Algal Bloom Hypoxia Control and Amendments Act. It was most recently reauthorized in 2017, and it directs federal agencies to participate in an interagency working group under that what is called HABARCA legislation. Again, the Harmful Algal Bloom Hypoxia Research Control Amendments Act. And the Corps is a named member of that interagency working group, and we work with agencies across the spectrum on HAB issues, and that interagency working group is responsible for making regular reports to Congress on our progress. And when I say a full range of agency representation, it's the co-chairs of the IWG are NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, the U.S. EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Then we have the Corps, and we have the USGS and the USDA and the NRCS and the FDA and the CDC and NASA and the oceanographer of the Navy and the Corps of Engineers. And I mean, it is every agency that has something to bring to bear to address these issues for the nation are there and actively participating, and they're doing great work for the nation. And they're engaging with their state partners, and in a very collaborative and cooperative way that is bringing the resources of the nation to bear on this topic. There are a lot of things that the nation faces in terms of environmental and water quality issues. This is a very important one, and it is being addressed by folks across the spectrum.
Dr. Clyde, I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down with me and discuss harmful algal blooms and blue-green algae. Thank you for joining us for Corpstruction. Corpstruction is a production of the Tulsa District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Public Affairs Office. Thank you for joining us for Corpstruction. Corpstruction is a production of the Tulsa District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Public Affairs Office. This episode of Corpstruction was brought to you by Civil Works. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day.